From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today during his weekly grain market segment, K-State's Dan O'Brien will report on favorable signs for U.S. wheat exports. Those, he says, are why local wheat basis is doing well right now. Then K-State's Sarah Lancaster will take up two crop weed control subjects, how hot temperatures can adversely affect the performance of row crop herbicides and what you growers can do to counter that. She'll also offer the latest on weed control in grain sorghum. Today's wheat harvest report features an update from Extension Agricultural Agent Chris Long of the Walnut Creek Extension District. And later, on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Welcome once again to another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Glad to have you along. The grain market's in review now with Dan O'Brien aboard from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas, Research and Extension grain market economist for K-State. Dan, put it this way, the markets appear to have embraced the reality that there will be no short crops in the U.S. production this year. Now, that can, of course, change some, but it sounds like most of the major row crops are off to a solid, if not terrific, start.
We've seen this in a number of years in the last decade or so, where if we get into mid-June, crops planted, things are up, going well, we start to see weakness in the futures markets, particularly new crop futures. So those slides into harvest haven't been smooth. A lot of times they've been interrupted with some dry weather and later in the season. And here we sit, almost July the 1st. So we've got, as it sits, about 45 days till the August crop report for the USDA. And there won't even be infield enumeration with that one. Again, they did away with that for budget purposes, et cetera. So the first infield enumerated measured number that we'll have is in the September crop report, which is 45, add 30 to it, 75 days away.
A ways away.
Yeah. So we were dry, exceedingly dry. Last week got some rains and are sitting okay now, but there is a good ways to go yet. And so we shall see, I guess, where the markets go. But again, as far as feed grains go in particular and corn futures, not uncommon at all to see that slide begin. In some years, it actually began in late May. One thing that'll come into play this time around will be next week, Tuesday, I believe, is the acreage report. The market is projecting, traders, and they do pre-report polls, whereas the USDA in their prospective plannings report had estimated just under 97 million acres of corn to be planted. Markets looking at more, on an average guess, I guess, about 95.2 million, a range of 93 to 97. The 97 being, that we got everything in, but others lower. So I think we learned last year that pre-report expectations of what the USDA will show in any of these things are, that's a tough way to make a living, because if anything, we have had a pattern through last year in particular, and ahead of that, of the USDA not lowering numbers as much as the market thought maybe they ought to, given what they observed in the field. Sometimes those changes have come later once they've had more evidence. But this is a big report. The USDA acreage report following on the heels later of the March prospective plantings. And this number, whatever they come out with on Tuesday, will be used by the USDA, I think, all the way through the September, October crop report. So it's a, quote, big deal. There'll also be a stocks report. And really for stocks report, the main thing we wonder on with those has to do with feed usage, especially on the feed grain side, and especially this year for corn. So we'll be watching for that too. But we have a pretty good handle on on exports from the weekly numbers, even ethanol feed grain usage on that too. So on the feed grains, we'll be looking to see if livestock feeding is held up, and we'll be looking at things on the margin, I guess, and on soybeans and wheat. Maybe some wheat feeding, but gosh, with all the cheap feed grains around, you would think we wouldn't have that much wheat feeding at this time.
Well, that round of new numbers from the USDA, again, this coming Tuesday. Speaking of exports, as you give the overview of this, you say, Dan, that corn and wheat have had a pretty good run of it of late again, while the soybean exports are flagging some.
Yes. For the week ending June the 18th, the numbers that came out yesterday morning, we had about 52 million bushels of corn export sales for that week, and that we need just under 50 to meet the USDA's projection. So gosh, anymore when you meet the USDA's projection, that's a pretty good thing. Grain sorghums continued its up and down move here last week. Had a great week. This week, kind of half of that, about 4 million bushels. I got about 8 the week before, but that's kind of the normal game, I think, in terms of grain sorghum exports. They're blocky and chunky. For wheat, overall, 26 million bushels. We need a pace of about 18 to meet the USDA's projection. And of course, we're just early in the marketing year, but that's a good sign. For hard red, interesting, what we grow here in Kansas, we had 11.5 million bushels of shipments for the week ending June the 18th. We need a pace of about 7 to meet the USDA. Well, the USDA hasn't put out their regular projection yet, but if we assume the same thing as last year, about 370 million bushels worth of hard red winter wheat exports out of the U.S., well, that's a great week. And it's just interesting to me that we're looking at futures being weak and in different sectors, et cetera. And of course, wheat has come down too, but arguably we're in harvest from the southern part of Kansas all the way through, and the reports we get, et cetera, they've kind of brought about the mindset of, well, okay, we're doing decently, but we're not diving off lower on prices. And actually, the basis levels in the central part of the state are very good. I think historically good. They're not great big positive carries, positive levels, but they're still very good overall. So here we're in the midst of harvest and not the worst of days in the wheat market. I would also say on the soybean side, weak soybean exports at this time. So weak shipments, about 11 million bushels for the week ending June the 18th. But with 10 weeks left in the marketing year, again, about 80%, about 19% of the way to go, we have literally 100% of the USDA's projection already bought ahead. That stuff can shift around, et cetera. So with action like that, how come the soybean market isn't just going much, much stronger? I think it has to do with political uncertainty between U.S. and China and all other issues that would come in. I still, Eric, you and I have talked about this for a while. Brazil has a bunch of problems in terms of COVID-19, and they kind of took a laissez-faire approach to dealing with that. And so far, it hasn't affected their shipments, but they're having problems. So I think that's always something to watch, and could offer a surprise in coming weeks if they just have shortfalls and can't keep up the pace of as they get to the end of this shipment year that they're in.
Well, Dan, you mentioned the relatively firm wheat basis at local delivery points around Kansas. How much of that has to do with the export business that you just described, or what else is driving that, if anything?
I think it's exports. I think that's primarily it. If you need a pace of about 7 million bushels to meet the USDA, about the same pace as last year, and here you had a week where you're at 11.5 million, what is that? That's 50, 60% higher than what you need. So that's all for the good. And, if this hypothesis I'm bringing out, it really holds true, then you've got the question of, well, what about the basis levels? Look out to western Kansas. We're in the midst of harvest. A place like Ulysses, Syracuse, 25 under. In the midst of a big harvest, a lot of times we'd be 40, 50 under, and they'd be turning away trucks and giving a really negative signal. So that's not too bad. And when you look at the central part of the state for wheat, Topeka, Concordia, 10, 20 under, Salina, 5 under, 10 under in Hutchinson, Wellington, 18 under, Great Bend at 12 under July. So interesting. Note also, though, that this is under July. We're going to roll over into that next contract into September. And so when we roll to the September contract, I think if we keep the same carry in the market and the price levels cash about the same, well, we're probably going to gain about 8 cents on our basis. It's going to be 8 cents worse looking just because we're just about to roll those local basis bids onto the new September contract. And we'll see where that goes.
Nonetheless, this is appealing in as far as marketing opportunities for wheat producers. It gives them at least some flexibility in what to do as they head to town with the new harvest.
Appealing in that appealing for them would be $6 wheat.
Right.
But
sure, you bet.
It's not as discouraging as it could be, is maybe how I'd view it. It's not completely falling apart. We're not approaching loan rates by any stretch and holding up decently. So if people do need to move wheat because of cash flow purposes, they're not completely on the defensive, perhaps.
Well, again, we'll be looking ahead to next week's visit as we'll go over those USDA numbers on crop acreage and the stocks. And Dan, of course, has captured everything to do with the markets as he's observed them in his weekly notes, which can be found now at agmanager.info. So producers, be sure to take advantage of that information. And Dan, as always, many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
That's the latest from K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien on the grain price trends. He's along with us each Friday here on Agriculture Today. Do want to make mention of something else you can find at agmanager.info. It's just been updated, the interactive crop basis tool. This can be used to examine historical weekly nearby basis for corn, grain sorghum, soybeans, and wheat for various locations in Kansas, as well as Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma, parts of Colorado, and Texas. You can plug in your location, the grain commodity you're interested in, and either a year or a range of years to evaluate. Then you can generate a report of data in tabular form or on a chart. This will give you an idea of how current basis compares to the historical trends. That tool can be accessed right there at agmanager.info. Producers, take a look at that if you're so inclined. We'll be back with more. This is the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Next up on this Agriculture Today, more on the weed control front as we're catching up with Sarah Lancaster, Research and Extension Weed Specialist at K-State. She's actually joining us from out in the field today as she's conducting field trials and checking on those test plots. So, Sarah, we have a couple of things we wanted to get into today on the behalf of the producer out there. One of them directly having to do with our recent conditions. Hot weather is starting to settle back in. Some questions arise, you say, on the minds of producers and others about the efficacy of our herbicide treatments when the temperatures are on the high side. You might speak to that a bit.
That's right, Eric. So as temperatures increase, obviously the plants are going to respond to those increases in temperatures. And so a couple of things come into play here. One is that the plants develop a thicker skin. The technical name is a cuticle. And so that cuticle becomes thicker and it becomes more waxy. And that makes it actually harder to get water-based spray solutions into the plant. So in those cases, the role of adjuvants become very important. But there's another side to that coin, Eric, and that is that as those temperatures increase, plants can actually respond more to adjuvants and oil-based formulations of herbicides, and you might start to see more crop injury. So it's a fine line there in terms of the response on both ends of the spectrum. The other thing to think about is that as those plants start to shut down, they actually stop moving sugars as much around the plant. And that process of translocation, of moving those sugars throughout the plant, is how a lot of herbicides, for example, glyphosate, get moved through the plant. And so in those cases, when we're talking about things like glyphosate or some of our grass controlling herbicides, things like Select or Post, we might need to think about increasing rates of surfactant or using that maximum rate of surfactant there, Eric, using maximum labeled rates, because those products are not going to be translocated to the active site within the weed quite as much as they would. So that's one thing you could do to mitigate hot weather. Another thing you could do would be to try to target those applications earlier in the morning. So plants have had the overnight to kind of recover from the heat stress. And so if you apply those systemic herbicides like glyphosate earlier in the morning, you'll increase the likelihood of getting good control there as well. I know I've had some questions this week about the injury component also, particularly with things like those group 14 herbicides, those PPO inhibiting herbicides. We've talked about the last couple of times I think we visited. Things like Cobra and Reflex. Those are associated with crop injury. And as the temperature and humidity increase, the likelihood of that crop injury increases as well. So one of the things you can do to try to get around that would be to think about making those applications later in the day, after temperatures have begun to cool off a little bit, so that you can avoid the hottest part of the day. It seems like the threshold for kind of what is hot is somewhere between 80 and 90. So start kind of thinking about it when you get to 85. And when you get to days over 90, start thinking about how you need to adjust maybe the timing or the composition of your herbicide application to get maximum effectiveness.
Well, Sarah, beyond worrying about the direct impact on the crop plant itself, does the heat affect the volatility of a given product? And that will vary from herbicide to herbicide, understood, but generally speaking, do we see an influence there?
Absolutely, Eric. So that's a good comment to make there. The herbicide that's been in the news a lot, dicamba, we know that it is susceptible to volatility. And one of the factors that influence volatility of any compound is temperature. And so as the temperature increases, the likelihood of volatility increases with it. And so, I was just talking about this with some folks this morning, that hypothetically an application was made under ideal conditions, but there are a lot of things that happen after that application that can potentially impact how that product behaves in the environment. Dicamba is a great weed killer, but it comes with a pretty big set of baggage, a lot of drawbacks there. And another aspect to think about as far as kind of product specific concerns related to the heat is that these hot days like this and high humidity are great days to try to maximize efficacy of Liberty products, glufosinate products. Those products tend to work a little bit better when it's hot, when it's humid, because they tend to work a little bit better when it's high humidity and high temperatures.
It's, again, a testimonial to knowing your product well, knowing what the label says. A lot of this is captured there in as far as temperature ranges for optimum application and so forth. So that's always a good reference, Sarah.
Yep, absolutely. The label is your friend, even though it's sometimes written in lawyer speak. The label is your friend. The weed control guide is your friend. Contact your county extension agent.
Absolutely. The other thing we wanted to get into in our time with you today, Sarah, grain sorghum weed control. And any grain sorghum producer knows that there have been uphill battles with that particular aspect of crop management over the many years. Wanted to ask you where we stand with alternatives that'll allow some success with broadleaf weeds or grassy weeds.
So that's a good question, Eric. It's something that's timely here as we think about products, particularly from a plant genetics, a crop genetics standpoint, that are going to be coming. As far as herbicides, there's not a lot of new development. So guys that are growing conventional sorghums, they're going to rely on the same types of products, the atrazines, the mesotriones as pre-emergence, 2,4-D and dicamba for post-emergence, things like that. Many of the listeners are probably familiar with Enzen sorghum, and using the branded herbicide is Zest. The active ingredient is nicosulfuron. So it's an ALS inhibiting herbicide that is good for grass control. But the new product that folks may start to hear about, I know I saw a popular press article on it just this morning, is called iGrowth sorghum. So iGrowth sorghum is also resistant to an ALS inhibiting herbicide. The seed is going to be marketed by a company called Advanta. The herbicides are going to be marketed by a company called UPL. So UPL makes a lot of generic formulations of herbicides. And so those sorghum varieties, they're positioning them to provide producers a good alternative for grassy weed control. You know, you need to choose where you're going to position something like that carefully, because with the Enzen as well as with the iGrowth, remember, those are both resistant to herbicides in that ALS inhibiting group. And we have pretty widespread resistance in some of our key weeds, namely the pigweeds, to those ALS inhibiting herbicides. So it's something that growers can look for information to be coming from the companies on. They're going to do a soft launch this year and really promote the product for next year. But growers will start to be hearing about that. But as growers consider these products, I think it's important to keep in mind that they're going to be part of a systems approach to weed management. It's not going to be, you know, for example, corn and soybeans when we first got Roundup Ready crops, right? It was kind of a one-size-fits-all program for a few years. These are not that. These are going to require some different, some more careful consideration of where you place these products and how they fit for you.
It'll be interesting to see how the new technology and the systems advance as they come on and how they fit our grain sorghum production here in the state of Kansas. But for the here and now, for our conventional sorghum hybrids, the old standbys, as you said, atrazine, 2,4-D, dicamba, have we resistance problems to worry about out there?
Yes, so we have pigweed populations in the state that have resistance to atrazine. I have just recently been contacted about a suspected population that's resistant to 2,4-D and dicamba out in western Kansas, and we've confirmed some of those resistances in populations as well. So, you know, herbicide resistance management really needs to be something that growers are thinking about. It's one of the situations where it may cost folks a little bit more in time and money up front, but the long-term benefits of that are going to more than pay for themselves, particularly in the pigweeds. Herbicide resistance is something that's very important. And that actually reminds me, Eric, this week there's a group called Take Action. It's funded by the United Soybean Board and the USDA and some other entities. They are focusing on making growers aware of some of the resources that are available to them through the Take Action campaign. And so those are resources to help growers manage resistance, not only to herbicides, but also fungicides and insecticides. So I would encourage growers, if they have questions, to do a couple of things. One, they can go to the webpage, which is iwilltakeaction.com. And another useful tool, especially for herbicide resistance management, is to download the Take Action app onto your phone. And it gives a lot of information about how herbicides are grouped in terms of their mode of action and can help growers identify what modes of action they're using in the products that they're considering. So 2 useful tools there for folks to think about when we talk about herbicide resistance.
And timely that a producer could tap into those and see what they have to offer in the way of guidance. Given, once again, the challenges that be in weed control in grain sorghum, as we've talked of here today. And Sarah, it's always a pleasure. Thanks once again for joining us and passing along these thoughts.
Thanks, Eric.
Research and Extension Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State has been along with us on this part of Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today is back now on the K-State Radio Network. And next up for you, another wheat harvest update. Once again, reminding you that we're speaking with county and district extension agricultural agents from around Kansas about harvest progress and results to date. So this time around, we'll hear about what's been happening in a part of west central Kansas, and specifically the Walnut Creek Extension District. That is comprised of Lane, Ness, and Rush counties. Extension Agricultural Agent Chris Long from that district is along with us now. Well, Chris, you'd say that the harvest was on the brink of really opening up, and then the weather interrupted.
Yeah, that's right, Eric. We got things started last week and actually was looking to get a good start to it. And folks in Rush and Ness counties, there were several of them got started last week around the 16th. And they kept for a few days, and a few more folks picked up, and it was starting to go. And then Friday after Friday and Saturday, it pretty much come to a screeching halt. And they've since picked up, but it got started, and then it's kind of been slow going to get back with all the weather. I know the fall crops were needing it too, but some guys are chomping at the bit to get back out there. We've had some weather a little more inclement than others that probably has already brought an end to some acres already prematurely. So hail has caused problems, but the rains were needed in some places, but I know guys are ready to get back after it.
So prior to these delays, any ballpark idea of how much harvesting had been completed?
Oh, prior to the rain, it was pretty minimal. I'd say well less than 5%, maybe 1 or 2% at the most as far as completion. Some elevators I know in the area, you get over to Lane County, and some of those elevators really didn't even take in their, on the northern edge of the county anyway, they didn't take in their first loads until about Tuesday, and even then it was pretty minimal for the most part. A few more folks are picking up here in Ness County and over in Lane as well. Rush County picked up a little bit more this past Tuesday when things finally did start to dry out after heavy rains, and they started to go a little bit, and then they've had spotty rains again since then. So it's been hit and miss over in Rush County. I think the western half of the county has picked up a little more so than the eastern half, and then the southern half of Ness County had really started to pick up a little bit, but it's kind of been spotty. Some guys are just barely getting started.
Well, working with what's available to this date anyway, Chris, what's the prospectus on the harvest? How is the wheat looking, and throwing in whatever we know about what has been cut?
From what had been cut, last week it started out looking, it was a little more, I guess, on the positive side. Test weights were up, comparative speaking, anywhere from, I think one of the lowest I had heard was maybe 59, and all the way up to about 64. So test weights were running pretty decent. I'd say on average it was a lot of 61 and 62 range on the test weight side. Unfortunately, protein levels, when you're talking quality, then suffered, and we weren't seeing much on that side of it, anywhere from 9 to 12 on the protein level, and so that was suffering, of course. And here in Ness County, I started to hear a little bit of some average yields hovering in the 40 to 50 range. At least that was some of the preliminary numbers that we were hearing from last week of folks getting started. And I think as harvest continues, we'll probably start to dip a little bit. I know there's some stuff on the northern edge of the entire district that got into some freeze damage. You get into Lane County, and I know they were getting into some lesser quality stuff. There were some loads taken in on Tuesday along that northern edge of Lane County that was dipping down with test weights down to 54. Even now the protein level had bounced up there, but that's the area where they were getting a little bit more freeze damage and causing some problems there. Southern Lane County will probably see a dip in yield, and southern Lane and southern Ness just due to drought conditions. There were quite a few acres in that area that didn't come up until this spring, so there were some dry pockets that, as those acres do start to get harvested, we'll probably see some lower numbers, at least on the yield side. But so far, I think folks had been at least pleasantly surprised, or they were at least they were feeling okay with what some of the early figures that they'd cut. Anyway, I know we did have some acres again that did get hailed out, and they'll be a little disappointed there. But so far, I think folks are somewhat optimistic about what's going on.
Chris, appreciate the report. We'll talk again soon.
All righty, anytime.
Chris Long with us. He's the Extension Agricultural Agent in the Walnut Creek District in west central Kansas again. That covers Lane, Ness, and Rush counties. Well, the cause of improving winter wheat varieties for you producers here in Kansas and surrounding states just received a major boost in the form of that sizable USDA grant. We told you about that earlier in the week. Not only will it support wild wheat genetics research by K-State's Jesse Poland, it'll create what will be called the Winter Wheat Innovation Breeding Hub, and will tap into international wheat genetics resources and expertise to feed its variety development efforts. Marcia Boswell has more on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The USDA's National Institute for Food and Agriculture has selected Kansas State University to serve as a center for efforts to improve U.S. winter wheat varieties. The university received $1 million to establish the International Wheat Yield Partnership's Winter Wheat Breeding Innovation Hub. K-State will lead the effort to evaluate research findings from several IWIP projects that contribute to significantly improved wheat yields. Hub partners will seek ways to stack or combine desirable traits from those projects into elite winter wheat varieties for U.S. growers. Desirable traits may include genetic improvements that make winter wheat more resistant to pest, disease, or drought, thus improving its yield potential. Edward Okanov, a K-State wheat geneticist and the project's principal investigator, said that stacking desirable traits called trait packages in wheat varieties helps researchers deliver key yield traits to U.S. growers as quickly as possible. Okanov said the hub is a public-private partnership between national and international wheat breeding programs, government officials, and industry. He said this partnership is established to maximize the value of research investments for the benefit of global agriculture by translating research findings into commercial breeding products. He said members of the new hub will test findings from IWIP projects to build trait packages for higher-yielding winter wheat. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Now on Agriculture Today, our weekly get-together to talk over the Kansas agricultural weather scene. Aboard with us once more, climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, to tell us about a wet week in parts of Kansas, as the numbers have it, and this factors into the drought monitor update, which shows improvement. What's the word, Mary?
Well, we kind of had a mixed bag in that drought monitor. There was improvement, mostly in the central and south central areas of the state, which saw the heaviest precipitation. There were some places that saw over 5 inches of rainfall. So again, very significant rains in that region. As you go west and east of that area, they did see precipitation, but not to the degree that the central areas saw. So northwest Kansas, which was on the lower end of the rain gauge totals, saw some expansion of the moderate drought in that area. There wasn't much change in west central and southwest Kansas. They were above normal for the week, so that was enough to basically hold the line. We didn't see any improvement in that area either because, again, they've got quite a big deficit to fill, and they by no means approached that, but at least it kind of held it off from getting any worse. The big area of change was in eastern Kansas, in the east central and southeast, where the abnormally dry conditions were added to the map. In that area has had a couple of weeks now with below average rainfall. They typically see a lot more, and so their deficits accumulate a lot faster when the rains shut off. Not totally negative for them. Those that had some wheat harvest to accomplish were able to get very good progress on that, and reports are that they had some very good wheat out of that, high protein and good test weights and fairly good yields. So again, they were happy to get it out before the diseases made any more progress on it. But on the other side of the coin, their summer planted crops could use some moisture, corn in particular, and soybeans. You were beginning to see some of the stress that accompanies the dry conditions.
The temperatures, though, did moderate, Mary, and that helped.
Yes, temperatures were much, much closer to normal. The week before, we were looking at statewide average of 6 to 7 degrees above normal. This last week, the statewide average was only a degree warmer than normal. And again, for most locations, it was right around what you would typically expect for this time of the year. Southeast was actually the warmest in the departure, and that wasn't necessarily the 100-plus temperatures that we saw in western Kansas, but those nighttime lows stayed elevated, and that tilted the average scale a little bit towards the warm side. Western Kansas did hit the century mark, but it was only 100 degrees, not 106, not 104, and not quite as windy as what we had seen in the previous weeks. So that was a relief as well.
But watching carefully, and you've been visiting with K-State's Ignacio Ciampiti about this, those overnight temperatures, as they have been bubbling up to the higher side, that does have implications for row crop development.
Right. Row crops, particularly corn, don't like those elevated nighttime temperatures. It affects the transpiration and negatively. So we really would prefer to have those temperatures drop down. The other thing is the diurnal variation, the difference between the high and low temperature, also impacts the movement of various materials through the plant. And when that's very narrow, it's not as favorable an environment for people or crops. And that's what we've been facing earlier in June, and that's what we are anticipating in the upcoming week. It is expected to be warmer than average as we go to the end of June and the beginning of July, but most of it is going to be elevated nighttime temperatures with the negative implications that brings.
And for livestock, too, we can't overlook that, the discomfort and problems that ensue there. As for that forecast then, warmer weather, seasonally hot weather, if you want to put it that way, muggy, but the rain chances will be around off and on, it sounds, for several days.
Right. What we're going to see is kind of an unsettled pattern, and that means that we're going to have a chance for convective storms, sometimes called pop-up thunderstorms. The difficulty with that is they tend not to move very much, so they can bubble up over an area, rain rather intensely, enough so that you can have flooding from it, but not move on to water another area. So you might have it come over your field and your neighbor be high and dry, or vice versa. It's also very difficult to say exactly where or how much coverage you might get from them. So we're looking at a 30 to 40, maybe as much as a 50% chance for most of the days of the weekend and into next week. But that will vary, and it will be highly dependent on what happens right over your particular farm, because it's not by any means going to be widespread.
So it makes it difficult to pin down a quantity of precipitation expected, or does it?
Well, they do have a quantitative precip forecast out for the next week, and that particular product favors the heaviest rains to be in eastern Kansas this week. They're looking at between an inch and a quarter to as much as 2 inches in the eastern areas of the state. And basically, they're talking Flint Hills eastward to the Kansas-Missouri border for those heavier amounts. You get a little bit on the west side of that, the amounts drop off. You might see an inch, which is less than we would typically see in a week, but still would be welcome for those row crops. Get out into western Kansas, particularly southwest, where the most severe drought conditions are persisting. They're looking at maybe a quarter of an inch of rain, and that is not going to do much at all. A quarter of an inch of rain, just to put it in perspective, at this time, the evapotranspiration rates, the estimated ET rates are more in the neighborhood of 0.4 of an inch a day. So a quarter of an inch is not going to provide any kind of relief.
All right. Mary, thanks as always, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Eric.
Along with us each Friday to get into the Kansas agricultural weather update, that's Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. And likewise, our thanks to you for being along with us. Enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.